Hi, Jerusha.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I can't complain. I'm doing pretty well. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Jerusha Lamptey. And you are at Union Theological Seminary in New York, where you teach, and where I actually have an affiliation now as well. I'm a visiting professor of science and religion there. And I wanted to talk to you about a number of things today, certainly including your book, Never Wholly Other, a Muslim theology of religious pluralism, which was published by Oxford University Press just last year, I think.
That's correct. Last March.
Last March, so it's about a year old, which is young as books go, especially if they deal with issues that are not going to go away anytime soon. And I'm sure the challenge of religious pluralism is not. So we will be getting to that book and the argument you make in it, and for that matter, what the word Muslima means, a word that may be new to a lot of people, and what Muslima theology is. For starters, I wanted to talk a little bit about your own background.
Okay.
You are what might be commonly called a convert to Islam. You converted, but I know there's something about the word conversion you're not wild about, as I understand it. So why don't you start off by telling us why you don't like the word conversion, and then we will talk a little bit about your conversion, or whatever you want to call it, instead of conversion. Okay?
So in other words, explain why I don't like that word, and then we'll talk about it anyhow. Okay.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Well, it's not so much that I don't like that word. It's just that I don't feel that it is descriptive of my personal experience. Many Muslims and people who encounter Islam after their birth, or rather than through other means, rather than just being raised in the tradition, do talk a lot about the word conversion, and usually opt for something. They talk about reversion, like going back to what they were naturally. This speaks to Islamic views about human nature that maybe or maybe not we'll get into later. But for me, I don't really favor either one of those. I more like to talk about it as a process, and about, maybe even use the term sometimes of accumulation, because I don't really feel that my encounter with Islam was something where I changed into something that I was not. I see just the whole process of my life as an ongoing dynamic process. I don't have another word for it, in which there have been new elements that have come along at different points in time. And even the elements that have come along, such as Islam, at different points, they have then subsequently changed. So while I have had a relationship with Islam for almost 20 years now, it has probably never been the same on any given day. And so it is something that even in and of itself evolves. So I like to talk about encounters and accumulation. This also has something to do with my view of religious traditions that I think we're going to talk about later when it comes to talking about my book.
Okay. So it's a little less, well, in a way you're saying, it sounds like, that it's less dramatic than the word conversion implies, or that it's less kind of binary. In other words, you're one thing one day and one thing the next, or maybe more static than the word conversion implies. The subsequent faith, in other words, the nature of the faith, is more static than the word implied. Is any of that true? Is any of that way?
Well, I think I would say that it's less about the binary, and it's also less about, changing from one thing to another as if that's a holistic and instantaneous process. And also, for my personal self, and this may not be, and probably is not everyone's experience, of course, it was not an act of rejection. So it was not giving up something to take on something else. And so conversion sometimes implies that, but it was adding something to me. It was accumulating something new, not just peeling off or discarding something else, as if, I'm not sure that's possible, but I think sometimes that the language speaks to that phenomena. I'm no longer this, now I am that. Well, I'm this and that. So.
Okay, well, let me, at the risk of getting too personal, let me ask you, before this thing that I'm not going to call a conversion, were you part of a different faith tradition, or were you just a non-believer, or what?
Okay, so with the risk of not answering any question straightforward, I was neither. I was not a non-believer. I think I believed in some things, but I was not raised in a tradition.
Okay.
I think I was raised in a family that had some sense of God and some sense of accountability to other people. But I was also raised by people who had had their own experiences with certain Christian denominations, and I don't think that those experiences were wholly enriching. Perhaps that's one way to put it. So we weren't raised going to a certain community or involved in a certain type of practice. I will also say that part of my journey was that I really was someone who bought into the rhetoric of there being a division between being intellectual and being a believer. And so most of my childhood was spent not because someone taught me that, but I just somehow absorbed that view and really thought that you could be intellectual and think things through, or you could just believe them. And it wasn't until I got to college, to undergrad, that I had that paradigm challenged. And so that was a big turning point for me, to understand that that probably wasn't a very sound division between being an intellectual versus being someone who had some kind of conviction.
Okay. So that you could become a person of faith without surrendering your critical faculties or your...
Yeah, and that there wasn't an opposition. I did sincerely think that there was an opposition, and I favored the intellectual side for a very long time. But then, to be frank, I met people who challenged that. I mean, as is often the case, you meet people who make you go, I guess that I didn't think this through, or I didn't have enough evidence. I don't know how to say that more straightforward.
So I would think, I mean, even if the conversion, in quotes, is not as binary as you might think, and maybe in some sense not as suddenly dramatic, there must have been a kind of a power to certain experiences you had. I gathered that a lot of this was, you were in Ghana, I think, right? Or some part of Africa?
Yes, that's correct.
And you had, so I guess you had gone there as part of your work or your study or something. And so was there something about Islam, as you observed it being practiced there, that had a powerful effect on you?
Yeah, so I mean, it was, again, a process. I mean, it wasn't just one experience. I had, subsequent to what I was speaking about before, encountering people who shattered my paradigm about the division between being an intellectual or a believer. I started to study religion, and I studied a lot of them, in a textual way and an intellectual way. And so I had an ongoing kind of curiosity from that point on. Yes, there were certainly things about Islam that I found very appealing to me on a personal level. What you're speaking about, my experience in Ghana, was really transformative, though, on a communal level. So there were aspects of the tradition and what I had read that really appealed to me as an individual. But then when I went to Ghana, to see the tradition lived and lived in a certain way was very transformative to me. It really made me want to participate in some of the communal aspects of it. And I can just say, although you haven't prompted this, one of those things was that Ghana's it's a very religious place in a sense. People live their religion out loud and in some ways unabashedly. And everywhere you go, stores are named after religion, and buses are named after religion, and talk about God and all different sorts of things. But it's very interreligious at the same time. And so to see how people could live their religion out loud publicly, but also have a degree of tolerance, was, again, another time that my paradigm was challenged, because I grew up here where we think that the way we get along in terms of religion is to just kind of keep it to yourself.
Right.
Or pretend we keep it to ourselves, which is the other.
Whereas in Ghana, there is religious diversity, and they're not shy about it, but as a rule, they get along.
I mean, historically speaking, not always, but historically speaking, the diversity has been there, and there has been a degree of stability, especially between groups, and respect, frankly. I was always astonished when I was in Ghana that all of the religious traditions, for instance, respect the Omuo festival, which is a traditional festival of the Ga people of Accra. And this is a festival during which they plant the seeds And during that time, which is a month long, there is a ban on all music, all drumming, even clapping of hands. And all of the other religions, and you can guess that some of those are churches and different organizations in which music plays a huge role, they all adhere by that ban. I mean, there have been times in history when they haven't, but by and large, there's this sense of respect across the interreligious engagement that was illuminating.
Okay. Now, on the issue of kind of intellect and faith or conviction, I hadn't actually planned to get into this, but since it's come up, I mean, what do you say to people who say, well, but wait a second, there is this intellectual side of you that you say is still in good working order, and you respect it.
I like to think that. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, as far as I can tell, it is.
Okay.
And what they would say is, on intellectual grounds, there's no need to posit the existence of a God. There's no, and of course, with some other religious texts, they would raise the question of, well, what about the creation story doesn't make sense, and so on, or the story of Jesus. The Quran doesn't really have so much of that stuff. It doesn't have much in the way of like miracles or anything. It doesn't have the same kind of specific creation story. So maybe, although the Quran does refer respectfully to the Christian and Jewish traditions, and very much consider Islam part of them, I would say. It doesn't. Maybe some of these issues don't come up with the Quran that would come up with the Bible, where you seem to see a clash with what science is telling us, or something like that. But even if that's the case, I think some people would still ask the question, wait, there's no scientific evidence of a God. Why, if you're really respecting your intellect as a source of authority, why are you believing in one?
Well, there's a number of things I would say to this. One is that I think that evidence is a very diverse construct, and what counts as evidence to different people is diverse. And I'm not sure I'm on board with the claim that there's no evidence, so why posit a God? Well, many people think there is evidence, and there is plenty of evidence, and so that can be a difference of opinion. And of course, what counts as evidence is something we define before our search for evidence. So there's an a priori assumptions on both sides of people who do posit belief and people who don't posit belief. And so sometimes the conversation is like ships passing in the night there. And I think that's probably worth thinking about. As far as, well, maybe in Islam or in the Koran, there aren't as many things that are intellectually challenging or in particular in opposition to science. Well, I want to say two things about this. One is about Islam and one is about other traditions. With Islam, I think that there is a history of an engagement with science that is very particular and fairly well known, and I'm not going to go into it in details, but what I will say is that there's not really the sense that science is in any opposition to belief. Because of the particular views of the divine, of human agency, and of human capacity, the idea is that there is nothing in science that does not aid in uncovering the creation and uncovering God. And so there's not an opposition there. They are not seen to be in conflict. Now, that doesn't mean it's always easy to explain. Sometimes it takes creative explanation, but that leads me to the second point I wanted to make on this topic in relation to some parts of Islam, but also some other traditions. We should never underestimate the fact that there is always human interpretation in play in our engagement with various scriptures or sources or events. And there's not only one way to interpret. And so, for instance, with the Bible and the creation narrative and an idea that it's a certain limited amount of time that contradicts the evidence, the scientific evidence on the ground, well, only some people hold that view, right? There's many other ways to interpret that content without foregoing belief or foregoing scientific details. And many people make that negotiation fairly easily. And so looking at how we make those negotiations is really, really interesting, without trying to force it into the cookie cutter mold of, look, we have evidence to contradict your belief, now stop believing, or we have beliefs to contradict your evidence, now stop having that evidence. There's other intermediate negotiations, which are really the fascinating area.
Okay. There is an interesting feature of the Quran, if I'm recalling correctly, which is there's a part of it that's kind of almost an empirical argument for the power and greatness of God. It's a reference to all the wonders of nature, and there's almost, I think, implicitly a rejection of like appealing to miracles and stuff, because I think the term used is signs, right?
Yes.
There's a long stretch where it says the signs of God's power and greatness are like, look at the birds, look at nature, and on and on. So whereas in the Bible, a sign is like, Jesus performs a miracle, or a rod turns into a snake, or vice versa, whatever it is, And this part of the Quran is almost saying, no, you want signs? I'll show you signs. Just look around at the actual workings of nature, right?
Yeah. No, this is in fact accurate, and it's something that it's part of the underlying theological infrastructure that, if you asked me, in my opinion, I would say supported the argument and the historical reality to which I just alluded. And that's that you have a text here that comes and says it's the word of God, it's the verbatim, inerrant word of God. Now, that doesn't mean literal necessarily. That doesn't mean without interpretation, but that means really important. And it comes, and it's very interesting what it says, because much of the Quran is devoted to saying, you want to understand what I'm saying here, then you need to look there. And the there is to the natural signs. And so it says, you don't believe in resurrection? Fine. Well, look at what happens, in the natural world. Things die and they come back, and it looks like it's barren, but then it comes back to life. And so there's this really interesting redirection to the natural world. And not to miracles, as you point out. Now, that doesn't mean that the Quran's not talking about miracles. It does talk about miracles, and in fact, it does affirm miracles that occurred previously, such as some of the ones that you're mentioning, as well as others. Mm-hmm. But what it does point out is that humans tend not to believe them for very long. And so that's a different theological stake. It doesn't undercut and dismiss the capacity or the potential of miracles. That kind of fits with a tradition that underscores divine omnipotence, because God could do whatever God wants, and that includes miracles. But what it says is that they're not really that effective. That humans tend to say, give me a miracle, then I'll believe. And then there's a miracle, and then they're like, and then, so there's an internal critique in the Quran. And I'm not saying that is, in fact, the reality. I'm saying it is one of the lines of discourse that come out in the Quran, as you're indicating.
And Muhammad does not walk around performing miracles the way Jesus does, right? That's not, doesn't. I think there's like one verse that's sometimes interpreted as something kind of amazing, but as a rule, there isn't that.
Well, there's two things that are said in this two things that are said in this regard. One is that when people, the standard off the shelf answer to this question, when you say, well, what is the miracle of Muhammad? The answer is, well, the miracle of Muhammad is the Quran itself. And so the Quranic text, especially its aesthetic value and its value as recitation, is seen to be the miracle. And so you actually see this throughout the Quran as well, because the Quran says, if they say that this is fabricated, tell them to go write something like it. They won't be able to do it. It's an interesting argument that is made, the Quran makes throughout. But that points to the fact that there's something about the miraculous, the ijaz of the Quran. That's how we talk about it, the miraculous nature of it. I should, however, point out that when you move from the Quran to the biography of the Prophet, to the Sirah, you will see a lot more references to Prophet Muhammad performing miraculous things. So
in the tradition that accumulated after the Quran, right?
I mean, some of the tradition that was narrated about Prophet Muhammad's life, and then the biographical constructs that come out as a
Right.
chronological account. Now, there's debates over when those came from. They were, of
Okay.
course, written down afterwards, but there are debates about when they arose and therefore the authority to be attributed to them. But they feature very largely in Muslim consciousness.
Okay.
The one thing I was just going to say about that is there are those reports that are much more miraculous there, but then you have to look at how people deal with those. Do people underscore them? Do people pay a lot of attention to them, or do they not? There's a notable characteristic in kind of modern interpretation, which is to like avoid the miracles, don't talk about them at all. But in historical, for instance, exegesis or interpretation, you will find many more people talking about them. In more modern discourse, you'll just see people run away from them in many cases and downplay them.
Now, speaking of exegesis and interpretation, why don't we talk a little about your book? Because I think you get into the business of how should we interpret religious texts. How they tend to be ambiguous. Muslims, as you point out, attach tremendous authority to the Quran. It is the word of God in the Islamic tradition, which is a little different from the way the Bible is viewed by most Christians and Jews. But as you point out, the question of extracting the meaning from it is something on which people tend to differ. And of course, that's come up lately in the context of the Islamic State, claiming that it's truly Islamic and so on. But you tackle this question in your book in a particular context. The context is the challenge of religious pluralism. Can we all get along? If we can all get along, what is that? Do we have to surrender claims that our religion is exclusively true, and so on? And in the course of addressing questions like this, you employ something called Muslim theology, which you can explain to us in due course. And you look at the question of what does the Quran seem to be suggesting, I think, about how religious pluralism should be handled. And so there's a lot there. And I'll let you start with any angle you feel comfortable with in kind of elaborating on what you're up to in the book.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I would start with talking about interpretation, because as you pointed out, there is, I'm making claims in this book about interpretation. And I think one of the most important claims, which is not highly specific to the question of religious diversity or religious pluralism, is really just to foreground the fact that interpretation is done by human beings. And so even with the centrality of the Quran and the confessional acceptance of the Quran as being the word of God, that does not mean that any human being has direct and absolute control over a singular meaning of that text. There are always human beings involved in deciding what that text means for a particular context and time. And so one of the key things I'm trying to do in that book is, like many other Muslim women who engage with the Quran, to foreground the reality of interpretation. And that is to say that humans interpret. Now, that does not diminish necessarily the source of that which we interpret, but it does mean that we always interpret through a lens. It is always mediated, and that's not a bad thing. I always like to say it just is. We are unable to understand except by going through language and going through our own experience. Just to add another layer to this, in the book, it's very important to do that, because what I'm trying to say is that only certain people have interpreted historically. And therefore, there might be new voices that would allow us to unveil new interpretive approaches that have never, ever been tried. And so that comes to the point of the Muslim theology. Muslim theology is my attempt to engage in a sort of Muslim feminist theology that is constructive, that is trying to bring some of the insights that Muslim women interpreters of the Koran have had in respect to gender and sexual biology. I'm trying to bring some of those insights and methods to bear on a new topic. So sometimes I like to say I'm taking insights on one specific form of human difference, that is gender difference or biological difference, and seeing how they might open up new interpretive possibilities in respect to another form of human difference, that is religious difference. And of course, that's not going to be an easy cookie. You just can't apply everything. You have to look conscientiously and decide where it would work and where it doesn't work. But the point is that those are new voices that have never, ever been brought to bear on that subject matter.
Okay. And does the term Muslim theology itself just refer to a theology that draws on feminist ideas, or is it something else?
Yeah, so I use that phrase, and not everybody uses that phrase, for a number of reasons. One is to underscore and emphasize what I just said, which is that when interpretation and theology is contextual, and because it's contextual, it really has something to do with the person who is doing it. Now, as I would say, that's not a drawback. Some people would say, oh, well, that means it's not, it's not objective. Well, of course it's not objective. It comes out of a context and hopefully speaks to a context. So that's one thing. It is to underscore my positionality as a Muslim female, because that's what it means. Muslima means a female Muslim. But it's also meant to engage some feminist thought and comparative feminist theology. And so to engage explicitly in identity theory and gender theory and discourses on different types of difference. And how that difference has been constructed in society. As we know, gender has been constructed in particular ways in particular societies. So that's a second aspect. But the third aspect about Muslim theology is that it is meant to carve out a new but relational space with other feminist theologies and a somewhat challenging historical relationship between feminism and Islam. And I've talked about this extensively, but just in a nutshell, it's fairly well known that feminist discourse, especially in the US and Europe, has been over the last couple decades co-opted to legitimate certain actions in parts of the world, and especially the colonized Muslim world, and that continues to go on. And what do I mean by co-opting? I mean that in order to legitimate certain actions, we say we're going to save the Muslim women, those poor Muslim women who need saving, we're going to go save them. And this is why they're oppressed, and we use the language and tools of feminist thought and theology to legitimate those enterprises.
Now you're talking about Western interventions. In other words, people outside of the faith who say, "Look, these Muslim women are oppressed. They need saving. Let's go in and do something about it." And that becomes a kind of basis for something you don't like. I mean, some sort of imperialistic attitude, or some sort of denigration of the faith as a whole, or what?
Well, what it becomes the basis of is, and I mean, I'm hesitant with the term Western. I think it's a construct that's kind of run its course, but that's okay. Right. But what it becomes the basis of is a very tensive relationship, because what it means is it's the assumption that one group of people knows what another group of people needs or wants or desires without ever asking that group of people. And there's an inherent assumption there that they don't know what they want. And so one of the things is that this Islam and feminism thing gets painted again as a binary, as if they're in conflict and as if Muslim women don't want rights and equality, but that's not the real tension. The real tension has historically been a tension that can be boiled down to most people don't like to be told what they really want. They usually think that they have a sense about that. Now, this isn't new or particular to Muslim theology. This tension, it's very characteristic of third wave feminism. And so when you see the rise of womanist theology or womanist thought or mujerista thought or Asian women's theology, all of these arise in reaction to second wave feminism, which was largely white and middle class and European and American, and also largely carried this assumption that there was a single model for how a woman in religion wanted to be. And so it's not relativism, but it's a little bit of an engaged pushback on the concept, saying, no, we might have other views. Our experience colors what we think differently than what you are imposing. And so one of the things with Muslim theology that I'm trying to do is acknowledge that tensive relationship, but not to give into it. I think that, just as a concrete example, many Muslim women scholars have been very hesitant to ever call themselves Muslim feminists. They don't like the term because it's just so embroiled in this history of power relations. So with Muslim theology, I'm trying to say, okay, let's acknowledge that tensive history as a very real fact, and let's acknowledge individual agency, but let's still be in dialogue with those formulations, because there's something of value there, if nothing else, just as a dialogue partner. And so it's trying to go beyond the reactionary binary of, you told us what we are and we don't like that, so now we won't talk to you. So there's and that's very reductive, but it's an attempt to carve out a new space, much along the lines of other third wave feminisms.
Okay. Now there's a way that I think, if I understand it correctly, you bring feminist thought into the question your book is addressing about kind of interfaith engagement and tolerance and so on. And it's the following. Tell me if I've got this right. So
okay.
you can when you look at people from different religions trying to get along, they can have at least three different attitudes. They can kind of gloss over the differences between the religions and say, look, we all believe fundamentally the same thing. What's the difference? So it's easy to get along. Or they can say, look, we believe different things, but who's to say, I'm not claiming I have my belief system is superior to yours. I'm not making those kinds of judgments, so we can get along. And then the third is, yes, there are these religious differences. Mine is right, yours is wrong, but I'm still going to be nice to you, right? And I think you point out that there's a kind of analog in feminist thought where, on the one hand, there is, at least in some strand of feminist thought, there is opposition to glossing over any differences between the genders and talking about a universal humanity. On the other hand, there's opposition to an acknowledgement of the difference that is implicitly or explicitly hierarchical. In other words, men better than women.
Yes.
And then there's a third way. And it should be clear which way remains of the three I outlined in the context of religion. In other words, well, I guess I don't want to say separate but equal because of the unfortunate historical connotations of that, but different, but not, but without any judgment about superiority, right? So I take it that third way is what you would like to take in. Well, you tell me. You pick it up there. Is the third way what you would like to bring into that's the approach you would like to prevail in the context of religious pluralism and the challenge of interfaith tolerance?
So, I mean, I don't think I would go as far to say what I would like to prevail. Obviously, my book is my personal interpretation. I think it's a well-grounded and fairly well-substantiated interpretation. But what I would like to prevail is for people to think deeply about these issues and not to be dismissive in an overly simple way. And as you've pointed out, there's two ways that kind of oversimplification can occur. That oversimplification can occur by saying, oh, my way is right and your way is wrong. That's fairly simple and clean cut. But it's also very simple to just say, oh, we're all right and it's okay and I'm okay, you're okay, and that's it. That's also another very simple way to contend with, or frankly not really contend with in a substantive way, the very real differences that exist within and among traditions. And so what I would say is that yes, the third way, but I actually in the book am trying to push it a little bit further. Because what feminists thought, and especially some of the work by Muslim women interpreters of the Koran, on Gender and Sexual Biology says is it's not just acknowledging difference. I believe you have to acknowledge difference. So the idea that we can just focus on our commonalities and then pretend like we'll just get along because we have some common ground, which we do, we have substantial common ground. But the idea that we can then just ignore all our differences, I just think that that is perhaps naive and not going to have any kind of longevity or stability because there are substantial differences. But what to make of the differences is what I'm interested in the book. And so what feminist thought brings to this, and the work of Muslim women interpreters brings to this, is the idea that it's not just that we have to acknowledge differences and then not assign any value to them. It's the idea that we need to distinguish between different genres of difference. So there are some forms of difference that exist in humanity that are simply different. And I talk about this in the book as lateral difference. It helps because you can imagine things lined up just on a line. They are ostensibly different. But those forms of difference are not assigned any kind of inherent value. So in Muslim women interpretation of the Koran on gender and sexual biology, they will say that biological difference is a form of this type of difference, but it doesn't have any inherent value. And of course, much of history has tried to assign an inherent value in order to say that if you're the male sex, you are superior to the female sex. But in reality, it doesn't have any inherent value. But, and here's the kicker, there are some other types of difference as well. And those differences are evaluated. The way I refer to this in the book is by calling them hierarchical forms of difference. Now, where are they? What are they? Because the problem, and it's not a problem, it's actually the beauty of bringing some of this thought to bear on religious diversity, is that for feminists and for Muslim women interpreters of the Quran, ignoring difference isn't an option. So we can't pretend like we're all the same, because usually when we pretend we're the same, we're actually pretending that we're men, or we're pretending that we're the dominant tradition. But we can't also just say anything goes and everything's okay, because for most of the people engaged in this discourse, everything's not acceptable. You know, if something advocates the abuse of women, it's just not okay. You know, so the relativism is equally, sameness universalism is as problematic as the other end of the spectrum, which is relativism and just saying, oh, we're all different, but all of our differences are okay. None of them are evaluated. So what I'm trying to do is say that it's not just about acknowledging difference. We acknowledge difference, but then we have to reckon with the fact that not all types of difference are of the same genre, that there are multiple forms of difference. And our challenge, and what I take on in the book, is trying to sort out in the Quranic discourse these multiple genres. Now, for Muslim women interpreters, and what I do in the book is really to differentiate between lateral difference and the category of Taqwa, which is a central theological category in Islam. And Taqwa is pretty...
How do you spell that word?
Taqwa.
Okay.
Yeah. And it means, most people define it as a fear of God or piety. I always define it as God consciousness, but also, so it's a mindfulness of God, an awareness of God. But it's not just an individual relationship with God. It is a mindfulness that must be actualized through social relationships. So it has a relationship to God that is then enacted in the world. And the Quran is fairly unequivocal about the fact that this is the sole standard by which people will be differentiated in the eyes of God. So Muslim women interpreters pick up on that, and I pick up on that too. In the discussion of religious diversity.
So you mean the nature of their taqwa is the thing God will focus on in evaluating people?
Yes, so this is what the Quran says. The Quran says, God is speaking, and God says, I have created you in nations and tribes so that you may know each other, and whatever that means. But then it goes on to say that the one of you who is the most honored is the one who has the most taqwa. So it's a clear juxtaposition between certain types of difference, nations and tribes and languages and colors, and this other criteria. So it's not an indication that all differences are okay, but it's an indication that there are different types of difference. And one of the problems is when we start using non-evaluated forms of difference as the basis of evaluation. So, for instance, that verse that I just quoted says nations and tribes. What if I start saying now, it says, I've created you in nations and tribes, know each other, but know that the only criteria you'll be assessed on is this other thing. What if I now sit down and I say, oh, because I'm, from this nation, I'm superior to other people? Right. Well, that verse is saying that nationhood is not the basis of your superiority, but this is. And so trying to discover those different genres in the Quranic discourse is really the heart and soul of what I'm trying to do in the book.
Okay, so that part of the scripture is saying that nationality and tribal affiliation are not valid criteria of evaluation. Religious consciousness is, or religious faith. Now,
Taqwa. Now, and that's
Taqwa,
the question.
It doesn't mean faith. It does mean kind of religious consciousness, I gather.
Well, It's very complex. So it's a consciousness, yes, but it's very multifaceted. Well, so there's many elements of it, yes.
Well, are you suggesting a reading of that would be so liberal in theological terms that you could be a Hindu and have great taqwa and therefore gain, not just meet with the approval of the God of Islam, but actually gain salvation?
Yeah, so there's a few things. One is that I am in the book as a result of trying to differentiate between these different genres of religion and to recenter the concept of taqwa. You come up against certain questions. And one of the questions is, what is the inherent value, if any, of religious communal identity? So, for instance, saying I am a Muslim with a capital M, or saying I'm a Hindu with a capital M. Now, historically, that has been very, very important. And it has actually in times, so for instance, the explicit profession of membership in the Muslim community has at times in historical discourse become the ultimate criteria for assessment, at least in the world of people. So some people will talk about, well, you can be a good person, but if you're not Muslim, it doesn't count. That's how sometimes the discourse has gone down. But one of the things that I come up against in this rereading, which is heavily semantic, so very much tracing these concepts throughout the entirety of the Quran, is that the Quran doesn't seem to barter in communal religious identity in the same way we do today. So the same significance that we attribute to these boundaries of religious communities like Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism, they don't seem to be the primary category in the Quran. What is the primary category is taqwa, is belief, is submission. But these are not cognates or synonyms for various religious communities, although I'll be frankly honest, and I talk about it in the book, many historical exegetes have attempted to contend that they are. But the text makes it very hard because there are texts, for instance, that say such things like this. The people of the book, meaning at least Jews and Christians, that there are believers among them and people who have taqwa among them. So what do you do with that verse? Now, what most historical exegetes have tried to say is to say, well, it means that they converted to Islam because they couldn't, but understand the reasoning there. The reasoning is that you could only manifest true taqwa if you're in the reified community of Muslims and you profess a communal identity like that.
So that would be a pretty conservative reading of the verse, right?
It would be a very conservative reading of the verse, but I will be honest. It has been, from a certain point in history, probably 13th century, it has dominated a lot of the interpretive process. It wasn't the dominant reading early on, but it is a little bit of exegetical gymnastics. Because it seems to say that there are people with this characteristic in other communities, which of course I argue in the book fits with many of the positive affirmations about other communities and other scriptures and other revelations. But it is a challenge to our notions of religious identity. But one other thing I would say in this regard is that with taqwa, as I pointed out a second ago, it's not defined by one feature. So if you were to say, according to the Koran, what does it mean to have taqwa? It doesn't just mean one thing. So I can't say it means to believe in God. And if you believe in God, you have taqwa. Because in fact, the most disdained category of behavior in the Koran, those are people who believe in God too. But you know what they do? They claim God as their own, like their property. They say, we have a special relationship with God. So taqwa is not just about believing in God. It's also about a whole litany of other things, which I chart in the book. And the reason why I do that is because that opens up the question of religious communal boundary, but it also makes us have to reflect on the fact that we as humans hardly ever live up to all of that. So now what do we do? We hardly ever manifest all of the characteristics of taqwa. So what sense do we make out of this? Because, and I'll just be concrete, historically, we have given greater value to certain aspects of taqwa over others. I just mentioned that at certain points in history, the verbal profession of membership to the historical community following Prophet Muhammad has become the apex of the facets of taqwa. But is it? Is that the most important? And how can you say that is more important than other things? Okay. And so it's meant to destabilize some of the assumptions, and it is provocative. I understand that, but it's also very textually based. So there's some questions there.
Yeah, it sounds like you're reading, or there's at least questions you're raising, whether or not you're making assertions. The questions you're raising would place you at the liberal end, again, in the theological sense of the term liberal, at the liberal end of contemporary Islamic scholarship, and in that sense, Union Theological Seminary is the perfect place for you to be, because in a Christian context, Union has been at the forefront of theological liberalism. Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr.
Sure.
I have a question about liberalism in Islamic context. Before we get to that, I do think it's worth pausing and just dwelling a little on a point you touched on, which is that on this business of the Quran's attitude towards Christians and Jews, there is, of course, fluctuations. There are times when unflattering things are said about them. But on this one issue of whether they are eligible for salvation in principle, I think a plain reading of the text, leave aside the gymnastics of those conservative interpreters, a reasonably plain reading of the text suggests that in this one sense, the Quran is more liberal than at least the strict traditional forms of Christianity and Judaism. In other words, certainly Christianity. The strict traditional form of Christianity would say, look, Jews aren't eligible for salvation, Muslims aren't eligible for salvation. But a pretty plain reading of the Quran says that by and large, Christians and Jews are in fact eligible for salvation. I just mentioned that because I think a lot of people don't realize that. You don't have to be some kind of wild-eyed liberal to get that meaning out of the Quran.
So I guess how I would respond to this is that I like to think of traditions, and especially the primary sources and respective traditions, and that does not always mean scriptures, right? Different sources, different traditions have primary sources. But I would say that the primary sources, when it comes to the question of religious diversity, very few traditions are without some ambiguities, as we started this conversation today saying that there's some ambiguities, right? And so I sometimes like to talk about traditions and sources as being filled with resources and obstacles when it comes to this question. And so that what human interpreters try to do is grapple with those and prioritize certain ones. And we do that, that's what we do. And sometimes we do that very elaborately and with great depth. And sometimes we do that very superficially. But there's always this kind of human negotiation in it. And the reason why I say that is that one of the elements of this puzzle, if you will, this wonderful puzzle of the Quran, is that it's fairly straightforward message. It says that, the Jews and the Christians and anyone who believes in God in the last day will have their reward with God. And then that's what it says, And so what to make of that? Now, I won't say that there haven't been interpreters who try to interpret that in a different way than saying that they will have some kind of reward with God. There are, but it does seem fairly straightforward in opening the door. One of the things is that as a self-identity, as a tradition, I don't think that Islam has a lot of stake in the idea of being new or unique. It's not really the central claim. And when it comes to religious diversity, it is worth paying attention to the central claim and what it's premised upon. And so maybe another way to rephrase that is, if traditions could speak, and of course they can't, and they're diverse and they'd have multiple mouths, and you ask the question, well, what makes you unique? You know, if you ask that question, or what's your special feature, that every tradition would answer differently, right? And maybe in multiple ways. But I don't think the response from most Muslim thinkers and throughout the course of Islamic thought would be, oh, this message is new. In fact, it's largely based upon the assertion that it's not new and that it's a reiteration or reminder of what came before. And so in that way, its relationship with what came before, meaning other religious traditions, inclusive of Judaism and Christianity, would seem to be more entangled. I would say that that does create some questions to answer in relation to some of the critiques of other religious communities that are found in the Koran. How do we understand them? Because it seems to be open on this question of the relationship to God or the hereafter, but then there are critiques. Now look, the tendency has been to universalize those critiques. My view is that the critiques are not critiques of religious communities, that they are critiques of individual people who don't manifest taqwa. And so that's a different type of critique, because it means that it's not about the community, it's about the actions. And so that's a different type of thing. As far as comparing to other traditions, I'm always cautious because I do spend most of my time in a space where people overlook the internal diversity of Islam. So I'm always cautious to not generalize to other traditions. I think that there are multiple perspectives within Christianity. Certainly there is a perspective that that is very centered on the singularity and uniqueness of the Jesus Christ event, and that focus on the singularity and uniqueness of that as being directly correlated with salvation, of course, will have ramifications for the views of other traditions and their salvific efficacy. But that is only one formulation of the event of Jesus Christ and the significance of that. And there are many other perspectives that are more pluralistic or inclusive, meaning that they acknowledge the centrality of that event, but they see it working through other traditions as well and working in other places outside of explicit alignment with the Christian community.
Sure.
So I think there's some diversity there.
Yeah, and I should say, I think the Second Vatican leaves open the possibility of salvation for people who aren't Christians. An ancient Christian theologian named Origen or Oregon, or however pronounce it, said the same thing and got into a lot of trouble for it. I think even Billy Graham, perhaps in a moment of weakness, he said, I think somebody asked him about Buddhists or something, and he said, hey, who's to say? You know, I mean, so, there is tremendous diversity. My point was that even in the original ancient text of the Quran, you see a kind of within the Abrahamic context, at least, a pretty clear kind of broad-mindedness about salvation, I guess I might say. Now, I wanted to, if you have time for one more question, it's to get back to this issue of liberal theological interpretation. Again, I'm not an expert on Islamic scholarship, but it sounds to me like you are probably at the liberal end. And I'm wondering a couple of things. First of all, what is there is a strong and important interpretive tradition in Islam. I mean, it is as, in some ways like Talmudic scholarship, I guess, at least in the sense that the text is interpreted by a series of scholars, and the accretion of interpretation matters and is taken seriously by believers. And it sounds like kind of an amorphous process in the sense that it's not like there's an official hierarchy of scholars, and it's not like the Supreme Court. Like, okay, here's the official position, and there's only one. It's a little more amorphous than that. And I guess I'm curious, first of all, by what process does a liberal theological idea start to get taken seriously and get closer to the mainstream of thought, A? B, is that happening now? Not necessarily just with your ideas, but with liberal ideas generally. And C, do you face challenges by virtue of being a woman in getting your ideas kind of entered into that process?
Okay. Okay. So just one question. I think that was that was a
three.
complex.
I was lying when I said one question. Okay. That was actually a lie.
That's okay. I've written them down, so hopefully I can remember what they are. So to the first question about, well, I have it won't come as any surprise that I have somewhat of a hesitancy to the labels. I feel that the labels of liberal or progressive or this or that or conservative are somewhat deployed in a way that doesn't necessarily reveal what you're asking, which is about authority and essentially change. And so perhaps I'll just skip to answering those kind of questions. So the question of how certain interpretations come to have some resonance. And what I would say is I don't even think it's worth distinguishing between supposedly liberal or progressive or conservative. I think that in many ways it's the same process. Sometimes we really treat interpretations as I said before, as if they're just like the direct word of God and that there's no human mediation going on, and that we've just uncovered the truth and therefore the truth is the truth and it shines clear. But in fact, even from the first event of Revelation, and this is kind of a theology of Revelation that would expand outside of the Islamic tradition, but for revelation or even any communication at all, but especially this goes to communications of revelation, for it to be heard or received, it has to speak in a way and be communicated in a way that is hearable. You know, it's like knowing your audience. You have to know your audience. So concretely, for instance, the Koran talks about it being an Arabic Koran, and it talks about every revelation coming in the language of the people that revelation was going to. Why? Because it needs to be able to be heard. Now, of course, it needs to be able to be heard, but I think that the term heard is more robust than that. And I think what it really speaks to is that it needs to resonate with people. It needs to meet them where they are. Now, that doesn't mean that it needs to pat them on the back and say, nice job, keep at it, what you're doing is fine. That's one way of resonating, but that's not the only way. Another way, and this is usually the way that Revelation with its prophetic criticism comes into play, is that it usually comes and is hearable. People understand it. It touches them, but it also challenges them. It pushes them. And we can see this in the Koran. We can see this in Jesus Christ. We can see this in other traditions all over the place. The message is not a message that is like maintain the status quo. It is a message that gets under your skin, so it resonates with you, but it challenges you to do something different. Now, whatever that may be. So, for instance, the Quran has a very socioeconomic justice bent about it. It's very concerned with socioeconomic inequalities, among other things. The reason why I'm going through all this is that I think it's the same process throughout all of history, including today. For an interpretation to gain feet, it doesn't just mean that it is true. It means for some reason that interpretation is resonating with the experience of people on the ground. And so you have to look at why. And I mean, we're not going to go into why, but I think that's the how. There is, for believers, there's the divine element, right? And then there's the human person. But there is this incubator in which the divine meets the human, and that is the community context. So resonates with your experience, but also resonates with enough people that it evokes change or response. Someone always, a teacher has always said this to me, and I think it's worth repeating, that, any of the traditions we know today that are major traditions, they would not exist today if there was no communal resonance. So if they didn't meet people and speak to them, and that they continue to speak, because of that resonance. Now, that doesn't mean without struggle or strife or challenge. I think they continue to present challenges over the course of history. So I think that's one of the hows. Is it happening in terms of interpretations that may be liberal or progressive? I think it's happening. I think it is resounding with people. And I'll just give an example, not from my own work, but maybe from the work that other Muslim women have done on gender and biological difference. And also even things such as, women in ritual prayer and leading the prayer. In 2005, Amina Wadud led the prayer here at St. John's, and it was a big hullabaloo to many, many people, and it was condemned by many people, and it was promoted by many people, but I don't know that it resonated to the level that such actions resonate today. Mm-hmm. That work is being picked up, and people are thinking about it, and people are thinking about gender inequality, and people are thinking about inclusivity in the mosque and what it means for women to be included in a way that is really evident. Now, do I think that enough work has been done? No, I don't think enough work has been done. But it is resonating. You can see people thinking about it. People are having workshops on it and panels on it, and they're doing movies and documentaries on it. So it is happening. But it's that speaking to and navigating the tradition. It's always a balancing act because, as you said, there is some kind of continuity of interpretation. And some of these other, and my work included, some of our interpretations are presenting challenges to that continuity. Mm-hmm. But at the same time as we present a challenge, we have to also establish some kind of authority that comes from the tradition. So it's a balancing act, right? Mm-hmm. And then I would tie this into your final part of the question, which is it a challenge as a woman, as a Muslim woman in particular? And I would say, yes, it's a challenge as a Muslim woman. And for many reasons. One of them is what I just said. You want to draw upon a tradition that, let's be honest, while there were women who narrated large components of the primary sources, women have been excluded for a lot of the history from the interpretive process, from the development of law, from all of that. And so you have the exclusion of a whole realm of experience and a whole bevy of voices. And so who do you draw upon? How do you draw upon them? And of course, there's an inherent critique. And so returning to the Koran and using the Koran as a legitimating standard is a primary method to assert authority and also challenge the arc of interpretation. But now there's some interesting work coming up that we need to do more. We need to do more than that. The other facet I think is worth pointing out is that as a Muslim woman, it is also a challenge because in my context, which is New York City, this time, this place, there's not only the challenge of dealing with change in interpretations and what I would call the kind of internal patriarchy, because that does exist. That's not all that exists, but that does exist. But there's also the challenge of dealing with what I would call external hegemony, and that is the expectation of what Muslim women might think, might feel, might want, or might aspire to, that comes from outside upon scholars. And so I sometimes like to talk about this as, competing discourses that place Muslim women scholars in particular in between like a rock and a hard place.
Right.
Because some of the things, for instance, I consider myself a critical lover of the tradition. And some of my critiques sound a lot like the critiques that are deployed by people who don't like Islam very much. Right. And so it is a tension to know that some of the things I will do will play into the hands of those people. So there's this tension between navigating authority, the tradition, the internal workings, but also some of the public discourse that goes on outside, and how you do or do not engage with that discourse in the pursuit of promoting your interpretation is a really big challenge. It's a beautiful challenge, but it's a present challenge.
So when you find yourself agreeing with Ali Hershey Ali on some specific issue, it feels awkward?
Okay, that doesn't happen that much. But in the case,
I mean, on a narrow issue, but
yeah, On a narrow issue, it's not so much agreeing with her, but understanding that we are woven into constituencies, and that one has to wonder what the objective is. I like to ask the question, why are you doing it? Why are you doing it? And that's important, because the critiques I may lodge about the tradition, they are not naive. They do not hold back, but they come from a place of love and a place of commitment. And and they aim to have, to explore beauty and to have the tradition be something that is positive in the world and contributing in a positive way. And so it's important to ask that question of other contexts and other voices when negotiating these tensions. Because even within the tradition, that same tension arises. What if I say something about the tradition that seems to echo someone who's really patriarchal? That's not always my comfort zone, because what is the intention? Where is that headed? And so there's a question of intention and objectives in doing the kind of work we do.
Okay. But in the long run, it sounds like you're saying new ideas can ultimately, or new interpretations can ultimately take root if there is enough resonance. And it's not just resonance at the scholarly level, it sounds like it's not just like, well, do scholars immediately like them? It sounds like if there's resonance at the grassroots level, so to speak, that, it's just kind of everyday Muslims around the world, that feeds back into the system in a sense. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, yes, I think that's right. I won't pretend as if there's not some kind of gap between scholarly discourse and on-the-ground discourse. Part of that is problematic, and part of that is also enabling, in that it enables new thought and new configurations. But when it ultimately comes to it, there is that need for communal residence and how it impacts people on the ground, and does it respond to them, and does it challenge them, and does it force them to think in new ways. So it doesn't just mean, it's not just about whether they like it, but it's about whether it makes them think about things. And to query their own positions on certain topics. And I think the way it does that is because I know with my work, I find it very important to be rooted in the tradition, to be doing things that come out of the tradition. But it's not just repeating the tradition for what it is. That's not really an option when it has excluded many voices, including ones that would have looked very similar to your own in the past. And so it is if what people pick up on the ground. But that doesn't mean that there's an automatic appeal. It should stir a discussion. If it stirs a discussion, then I think that's an indicator. And I would also just say, as a general thought, in terms of whether these interpretations gain traction, is really a question about change in traditions. And many of our traditions like to barter in the idea that they have never changed, and that is something that makes them of value, that there's inherent value because they have the truth and they have the right practices and they've never changed. Why should they change? They're perfect. But the historical reality is they have changed. And they continue to change. And so one of the things that I'm very much interested in is not debating whether or not they can or have changed, because they can and they have, but looking at where and why, and the question you asked of how they change. Those are the really interesting questions for me. Change happens, but where and when and what kind? And when it comes to gender and things like that, why is it so hard for change to happen there? It's a big question. Why has that become so charged in ways that other things are not?
Okay. Well, thank you for patiently answering all my questions. We've talked longer than I thought we would, but that's because I found it all so interesting and I kept having new questions. So I really appreciate it. The book, again, is Never Wholly Other, a Muslim Theology of Religious Pluralism from Oxford University Press. And I hope, you'll have time to do this again sometime, Jerusha. This was a lot of fun.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.